It also has the great benefits of having fresh food. You know where your food's been grown, you know nothing's been, if you're growing, you can grow flowers too, and they can bring great joy. But if you're growing your food, you know that it hasn't been treated, you know where it's come from. And it's fresh. You don't have to store it in your refrigerator. When it's time to eat and I need a salad, I just go out to my kitchen garden and I cut my greens fresh. And then I don't have to worry about storing them in the refrigerator and then having, you know, storing them improperly. But overall, we garden because it makes us happy. So it makes me happy. But you say, isn't it a lot of work? And, you know, traditional gardening, the way in ground, it can be a lot of work. But raised beds really do lighten the workload, and it can reduce the amount of lawn you have to care for. That's always good if you have a lot of raised beds. And there are a lot of tools and things that can help support gardening as we age. So why raised beds? They really are simpler. They're an elevated setup. You create the perfect soil. So your success rate is a lot higher if you put the correct soil in your bed to begin with. They come at different heights, so they can be elevated to like waist height so that you don't have to bend at all, or they can be about 15 inches off the ground, and it still eliminates makes a huge difference in reaching your plants and tending to your plants. It's better drainage. Your soil mix itself is going to be created for helping good drainage. It's going to be created to uniquely retain moisture, but also allow drainage because it's elevated. And you're also going to find that you have a lot less weeding because the seeds that travel and seem to proliferate in the ground don't seem to do so in the raised bed as much. And because your soil is looser, even if you have a weed or two here or there, it's so easy to pull them out. There are a lot of different types of raised beds. And you're gonna, the number on the market, I mean, just looking for them has really exploded, but you'll see off to the left, you see a couple of cedar raised beds, and they're higher off the ground. Those have bottoms in them. Some of them come with like self-watering bottoms. And then to the right of that, you'll see some other cedar beds that are made with brackets. And those were like the original ones we put into the community garden. And we still have them there. Cedar lasts longer than a lot of woods, and it's safe for growing food, but it does eventually rot. And so we're actually in the process of replacing, as some of ours are rotting, and we really don't want to have to keep replacing them because we've replaced a few of them, at least once. So we're kind of shifting to the galvanized metal beds, which you see all the way to the right. And we have a couple of those. We got them in the earth brown, so they kind of blend with our cedar beds. And anytime you want, you can walk through the community garden and you can see these in place. And then I have those same metal garden beds at home. I've got about, I don't know, 10, they keep expanding. I have a lot of them, and I've had some of them for 5-6 years, and they look brand new. They're very durable, they last, they're easy to put together. And I think they're pretty reasonable in cost. They also have grow bags. If you live in an area where you have a patio, maybe you don't own, maybe you rent, but you want to grow, you can grow in any type of container. It doesn't have to be a permanent raised bed. And grow bags actually can help plants be very successful because the air naturally like prunes the roots. And so you don't get them, they don't get root bound in the bags. And they even make bags where the windows roll up if you're growing root vegetables and you want to harvest your potatoes. There's all kinds of them. And then there's non-traditional raised beds, like you can take old dresser drawers and repurpose them into a fun thing in the garden. You know, you can paint them, drill a couple holes in the bottom. They'll eventually rot, but if you pick up a drawer at, you know, at Goodwill or someplace, it's kind of a fun project. And you can also repurpose like feed troughs and all kinds of things, whiskey barrels. You'll see some of those. And here's a couple of more from from my gardens at home. So off to the left, there's a whiskey barrel. It's got collards growing in it, and they've done really well in there. And then to the left of that, I added a privacy wall at the end of the patio. And now every time I add something, I think, well, how can I make it into a raised bed planter so it's functional and I can grow food in it? And so I put a lot of my herbs in here, and sometimes in the winter I put greens because I'll actually hoop it. And so that I just have to come right out of my house to get herbs when I'm cooking, and I have access to them. And then to the right of that's another type of raised bed planter. It's made with metal and wood, and you'll see a lot like that around. And I've got herbs in there too. And again, it's right off my porch. Along the side, I've got, this year I decided to try some potatoes. So I threw some potatoes in some whiskey barrels, and they're doing really well. So there's lots of types of containers that you can use very easily to just get started growing something, just to see what you can do. So the next decision is whether or not you are going to build your raised beds, buy them, or like rent at a community garden. So there's a lot of resources out, of course, on the internet, between YouTube videos that show you everything you need to know, do-it-yourself plans. You might have scraps of wood and materials that you can incorporate already at your house. But there are a lot of plans available. It may or may not save you money building them, depends on how many materials you have at home, and with the cost of building materials lately, you might find better deals in other in pre-built ones. And the longevity varies. Like I said, the cedar can eventually rot in several years and has to be replaced, but a lot of those are built with brackets, and then you just replace the boards. But or to the right, you can find these concrete or cement ones at Home Depot or Lowe's, and you can see the slots there. You can actually slide boards in. A very easy way to build a raised bed, and you can stack two of those on top of each other, so you can get the height you need from the ground. Most of the raised beds that you have are bottomless, unless it's elevated in the air, and then it usually has a bottom. It could be a self-waterer or not. It just depends on the type that you buy. But usually you put like landscape fabric, or you can put cardboard down on the bottom as you're filling it with soil. So here's some different types that you can buy, just to give you an idea of what's out there. These galvanized steel beds that I talk about, that you can find at Metal Garden Beds in a lot of different places. Here's a 7 foot by 3'4", and it's about $150. They have a lot of different sizes. There's one that's even smaller that I think is about $80. Your elevated garden beds will cost more. They range from, I've seen them for $300, for $200, but I've listed some places where you can find them. Gardeners.com is a good resource. Earth Easy, Tractor Supply even has them. And there'll be a link where you can get access to this presentation later to find this information. The cedar raised beds, they range in price depending upon the size. You can pick up brackets sometimes for $40. So if you already have the wood, that can save you some money. And then the grow bags are pretty inexpensive. Like a 10-gallon bag, you can get a 5-pack for $25. So there are a lot of options there. And then another option is to rent, and some community gardens offer garden space for rent. Like I said, ours is unique because we have raised beds, and we rent our raised beds out for the year for $60 for the year. The benefit of a community garden, you have collaboration with other gardeners. You have a fixed annual fee. You don't have all the setup cost of trying it out. Maybe you just want to try it out and see if you can grow. A lot of times you get access to extra tools and resources. We have a shed that has a lot of tools. We'll bring in compost for the gardeners. You have access to water. So there's a lot of advantages to it if you're just starting out and experimenting with it and you live nearby. The cons to a community garden might be it's just a little bit less convenient than having it right in your yard and being able to go out and check on it. And some may require some volunteer hours in the common areas of the garden, but it's an option. So getting started. So you decide that you want to try raised bed gardening. So we're going to talk about some of the planning you might want to do and some mistakes you might want to avoid, what you need to do to set it up, anything unique about planting in a raised bed, and then what you need to do to maintain it. So the first mistake to avoid is really choosing the wrong location. And a lot of times we're apt to put something where it is out of the way maybe, or it just fits nicely, but it may not be the best place for growing because you need 6 to 8 hours of direct sun and you want it in the south side. So it's a good idea to walk your property at different times of the year or the area where you might be growing to see how the sun is falling. And there is a website you can go to, suncalc.org, and you can put your address in to see how the sun falls on your property at different times of the year. And that can help you kind of figure out where to put it. On my side garden that I'll show some pictures of later, I started out with one raised bed that was kind of close to the house, and I used that a lot for my winter planting, so it would be close to the house. Then I had to move it when we had some chimney work done because there's no way they could have gotten the scaffolding up. And I decided I'd placed it too close to the house anyway because it was creating some drainage issues near my foundation. But I'd put it there because it was conveniently on the mulched area. It was kind of out of the way. It got the right amount of sun, but I really needed to move it away from the house. So I put it where it belonged. And once I did that, it kind of redefined that space in my mind. And when I added some this year, I ended up putting them in, building out that whole area and just kind of removing a lot of the grass that was there and kind of making it a side garden because it was really the best place to grow. So sometimes we put things in a place that isn't the best place to grow. So make sure you have the right amount of sun and it's convenient. That's important too. You want to make sure you plan for water. If your garden is too far away from water, will you be having to drag your hose out? Do you have enough hose? Maybe your plan is just to water with a watering can if you don't have a lot, which is fine, but you might be taking a lot of trips back and forth to your water. You can set up irrigation with soaker hoses and hook your hose up to water your plants, but that's not required. Sometimes just tending to your plants makes you take more notice of them and notice when you have bugs maybe or disease issues cropping up that you might not notice if everything's automatic and you just turn the water on and you don't have to walk out to your garden. Because you're going to water every 2 to 3 days if there's no rainfall. Your raised beds may dry out quicker than in ground, but you can help prevent that by mulching a little bit, and you can mulch your plants, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then probably another big mistake is just not investing in the correct soil mix. If you're not really just taking garden soil from the ground and putting it in a raised bed. Some people do, and you can, and that will raise it up a little bit and it'll help, but it might still be too impacted. Usually your typical raised bed soil, when you run your hands through it, it's kind of light and airy. It allows drainage, and it's not like the compactness of garden soil. Your soil is what feeds your plants, so it's the good old garbage in, garbage out. You really want to have good soil, and they do sell raised bed soil mixes. They will be a little bit more expensive than if you mix your own, but it's definitely an easy available option. And you can also do a hybrid of mixing your own and using pre-packaged raised bed soil mixes, and we'll talk about filling your box in just a little bit. You want to make sure that you mulch if you can with organic matter or straw to keep the soil from drying out. It's not something that I always did. I'm just really kind of starting to, you won't get to do all these things the first time out, or you'll never get started. So what happens is you take care of the most important things, and then over time you add skills. And so this year, like, I have goals every year. So this year I'm trying to mulch my raised beds more to keep the moisture in so that they don't dry out as quickly. So shredded straw, we have leaf grow around here, which works. Maybe you compost your own leaves in your yard, and you can use shredded leaves to mulch your plants as well. And then if you're putting in several beds and you're designing like a garden area, you just want to leave enough space around the beds. The idea is that you should be able to walk all the way around it and reach in. So that's why you typically won't see raised beds wider than 4 feet, because it should be your comfortable reach. You should never step on your raised bed or get inside it. I've seen some people do that. That compacts the soil, and that the whole idea of is to stay off the soil and walk around it. So just make sure that you can reach in. It might seem like a good idea to make a big 8-foot bed or something, but then you've created an issue where you can't get to the center without walking around it. And then finally, when you place your plants in, you have to again think about the sun and how plants are going to shade each other. You would probably do that in an in-ground garden as well. You can see in that picture, there's, I think, garlic and there's lettuce, but some plants are going to be taller than others. So you want your low growers on the south side where the sun's hitting them first. And then your tallest furthest away, because it's going to create shadows, unless you're trying to grow something like lettuce and it's a really hot time of year, then you might actually place some tall growers and then put your lettuce behind it so that it's slightly shaded and maybe can grow a little bit longer. And then when you're not growing, then you want to try to take care of your soil as well. So you can actually plant cover crops in your raised beds. You can plant red crimson clover. There's a lot of different ones, but the clover is really pretty, and we planted that at the community garden in all the beds too. And then you can just kind of turn the clover over. Or add compost. You can put that prior to planting, but it's also kind of nice to amend it at the end of the season too. And again, there's a lot of organic composts that are sold. There's leaf grow, but then there's also ones that have manure in it. Chicken manure is good. Worm castings are great. There's a lot of different amendments you can add. And then of course we care more about what we know and manage what we label, what we know we have out there. And I'm guilty of not labeling my plants all the time and thinking I'm going to remember what I put where. Now I'm actually using a garden planner from Territorial Seed. They have a free garden journal you can use on the website, but they also have a garden planner where you can actually plan out your beds. And because I have so many beds, it also helps with crop rotation and things like that. So I'm kind of trying to use that and keep track of actually the varieties and where I'm putting my plants. But when you're planting and how many days to harvest, so you kind of know when an area is going to turn over, and you're always thinking about what am I going to put in that space next, or at least I am, because you really do have a lot of seasons. You can grow here year round, and you can harvest things from like March to December. So I usually have greens growing through December. If it's a mild winter, I've pulled stuff out in January and February. I usually start carrots and a lot of things in the fall. Some of the things that I learned from being a member of a CSA and how the farmers do it, and put a lot of things in the fall and then overwinter it with hoops and covers. And then you get a really early start on your spring, and you don't have this spring rush to plant. So there's lots of things you can do with it. So we talked about whether you buy or build a raised bed or rent. And so I'm just going to touch a little bit on the soil mix, some of the options out there, and how to go ahead and fill it. So of course, how much soil depends upon the size of the bed. And again, there will be a link where you'll be able to go out and access this presentation so that you can, if you want to reference back to this, you can see how to calculate how much soil you're going to need for your bed. One of the common ones that's out there, the Miracle Grow raised bed soil, they sell that at Tractor Supply. It's a 1.5 cubic foot bag. They also sell it at other stores like Home Depot and Lowe's. And there are also some other organic brands out there that might be a slightly bigger bag. But this is a pre-mix specifically for a raised bed. And you can, I'll talk about some formulas if you want to try to create your own. But a common bed size is like a 4 by 8 foot bed. That's kind of the size of beds that we have at the community garden, about 15 inches deep. And so you have to try to figure out how many bags you're going to need. So for that, as an example, you basically have to convert it to cubic inches so you can figure out how many cubic feet you need. And what this slide shows is that to fill that bed, you would need about 27 bags of raised garden bed soil. Now that's a lot. At each bag costs you $8 to $9. It's never on sale when I need to buy it, fortunately. And Costco used to sell 3 cubic foot bags, but they didn't have them the last 2 years. But you can also, so say 27 bags, I mean, you know, it can cost a couple $100, $150 to, depending on the size of the bed, to initially put the soil in. But once you put that soil in, all you're ever going to do is add compost to it. So it is an investment, but you're going to get a lot back out of that soil. And I'll give you some ideas how you can build your own too. But I typically, like for a bed like that that needs 27 bags, I will use less than that, and I will augment with, I will fill some of the bottom couple of inches. I'll use some like leaf mold and leaf compost in the bottom layers, and eventually it will sink and I'll have to add some, but that kind of spreads the cost a little bit over more than 1 year, because I'm going to be adding compost to it every year anyway and topping it off as it sinks down. And as I grow and I remove plants, I'm also, you know, sometimes losing some of that matter too, and I'm going to have to backfill the bed a little bit. But if you this is available here to reference back if you need to figure out how much soil. Mel Bartholomew is kind of considered the father of square foot gardening, and he's got a book out there that's fantastic. And it kind of is, to me, it's like an all-in-one garden book, but it's really nice. It's got a lot of pictures and a lot of information in it. And his mix is 1/3 peat or coconut core. Coconut core is sold in like a brick, a hard brick, and it expands with water. So you add it to a bucket and you add water to it and expands to multiple times its size. So peat moss or coconut core. Some people move away from peat moss because it's not a renewable resource. It's easier to find than some other things, but vermiculite I found more difficult to find. Perlite I found was easier to find. I'm sure it depends on which store you go to. But he does a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and his blended compost is using leaf grow type stuff, chicken manure, just a variety. And so you would mix it on a tarp or in a wheelbarrow, and then you would add it to your raised bed. Another recipe for that is 50% topsoil, 25% compost, and 25% organic matter compost mixed up. Colony Supply does sell some things bulk. They sell compost leaf grow bulk, which is a lot cheaper than bagged leaf grow. So if you have a lot of gardens, it's a good idea to just get a bulk delivery of that. But they also have a 50-50 mix of topsoil and compost, which gets you kind of close to what you might need. And you might find that to be a lot cheaper than buying bags too. Sometimes the advantage of bags though can be that it's easier to get them to the location where you need them. So it all depends on what your needs are. So the next thing, not any different from planting in ground really, is just knowing your planting zone. And so there's the hardiness maps that they put out that shows that we're in zone 7, and even zone 7 is broken up a little bit depending upon where you are in the county. And so once you know your planting zone, then you can figure out from the general planting schedules, and these come from the University of Maryland Agricultural Extension, and they've got fantastic website resources that are specific to growing in Maryland, which is really what you need. There's a lot of helps out there on the internet, but then you have to be careful. You might be watching a video from Michigan, and some of the general planting things and things that they're doing are apply, but some of them may not because of the area. So I always recommend if you're new to growing food, to just start with something easy like greens, lettuce. You want to position yourself for success. So if that means purchasing a couple of vegetable plants to get started, then you do that, because you don't really need that many to get started. So you may as well make it so that it's successful. If you're successful and you get produce and it goes well, you're more likely to continue. And then there might be different types of varieties that are more suited for what you're growing in. Maybe if you're growing in a grow bag, you want a more compact variety. Like with beans, you can grow bush beans, or you can grow beans that are going to require a trellis. So you just have to decide what's going to be easier for the raised bed or area where you're growing. And most importantly, plant what you like to eat, not what other people are planting. Like, don't plant radishes if you don't eat them. I've done that, and I'm like, oh, don't really need them. So I mentioned Mel Bartholomew as the father of square foot gardening. He says if you have a raised bed, if you haven't actually divided your space into 1-foot grids, you're not square foot gardening. And he kind of has a point there. So this was the first year I actually, because I got the book, followed his advice a little bit more closely. I'm actually gridding off my raised beds. And I do find that it helps with like better defining areas and succession planting. So I can plant a square. I can plan that I'm going to have 3 squares of beets. And I'm going to, in the first square, I'm going to put my beets in. And then 2 weeks later, I'm going to plant the next square. And 2 weeks later, I'm going to plant the next square. And now I've got them coming in at different times. And it's just it's a kind of a nice way to manage your growth and how you're planning out. And then when you fully harvest a square, then it's easy to see that that square can be replanted with something. And so with the spacing is similar but different. You can see people who are used to growing in ground, because when they go into a raised bed, their first instinct, as was my first instinct, is to plant in rows in the raised bed. But actually you can use the space differently. The reason we had rows was because we had to walk in between them, and we don't need to do that in the raised bed. We do need to give the plants the spacing that they need, but we can lay them out differently. We can use the whole square, and we don't have to leave row spaces. So there's you can find charts online that show how many plants per square, for each square foot in a raised bed garden. And so this is just an example of some, like you can put 4 per square for spinach, and 16 for radishes, but only like 1 tomato plant. And I actually wouldn't put 2 tomato plants next to each other. I've done that before, and that you really have to put something else in between. You've got to leave more spacing. But those are the kind of things you learn trial and error, just from trying different things out. Like in between 2 tomato plants, you might put something that's a little bit low, and maybe it wants shade, and maybe that might be some lettuce or a green. Maintenance of the raised bed, I think, is probably one of the selling points of it. It's very easy, and it is joyful, because you just water, you go out, check on your plants. When you plant your plants, it's very easy. I mean, the soil is just so loose. You put your plants in, you can put some mulch around them. You're not going to expect to see very many weeds, but you're going to want to go out and check on them. You're going to want to feed them like you would any other vegetable plants and organic food on whatever schedule based on what you've planted. And you want to harvest them regularly because that helps with the production of the plants. And you want to check them for pests and just kind of note their conditions. So your time ends up being focused on really the gardening task and not all the weeding and keeping the area that you're not growing in weeded and things like that. So maintenance is really very simple. Usually what I'm just looking at is managing schedules, and okay, when is this going to be finished harvesting and what am I going to plant there next, and do I what do I need to be prepared for that. So I think that the joy of the raised beds comes from not having the drudgery of weeding large areas where you're not growing. The fact that you're starting with a perfect soil mix. Weeds are kind of rare. Your soil quality is so good. You're composting, putting compost in every year. There are a lot of tools and things that can also make it easier. So on the left, we found this faucet grip, which is wonderful. When we replaced the faucet with a new one, it was so tight and hard to turn that, it would practically take like a wrench or something to turn it. And we found this grip, and it's amazing. But for dexterity, and especially as you start getting a little bit of arthritis in your hands, it's kind of nice. They make a lot of tools like this kneeler and garden seat. It can be used to kneel. It also then has supports to help push yourself up, and then it can flip upside down and become a seat. So if you're working in a raised bed, you can pull it up next to the raised bed. It's kind of nice. They make elevated raised beds that are even higher, and as I said, as you're filling that raised bed, you see how tall that one is. It doesn't have a false bottom. You wouldn't put raised bed soil all the way down to the bottom. You could, but your plants don't need it. They only need about 15 to 18 inches, depending upon what you're growing. It's really more the top layer. So you would fill the bottom of that with like sticks and brush, things that are compostable, leaves, to get you up to a height, and then you would put your quality soil in. But there's also the type of raised bed that do have a false bottom and they have the legs. So those can be nice on a patio too, or along a house or something. They make a garden scoot, which has wheels, and it's got a handle. You can pull it around from area to area, and it's got room for a tub truck bucket on the back. And that's me sitting on it with my seeding square, which they make, that makes the planting in a square much easier. So that you get them spaced right. But so those are just some things that are available. I've just kind of added on to things every year. You kind of dream big, and you kind of see where you want it to go, and then every year I just add something different. So I just added in a couple of pictures of my raised bed garden. So this one on the left is what I call my kitchen garden. It's on the side of my house. It's a very small strip of land between the driveway and the house. And I just added this U-shaped one this year, and that tall trellis is peas. And I just planted some tomatoes in that bed because this is my hottest area. It gets a lot of sun. And then there's one more bed behind it. And then I have a lot of that's where all my buckets are. And to the right, that was my original garden, which started out all in ground, and now it has several raised beds. And then the other half of it in ground still is strawberries. And I'm totally willing to weed my strawberries because I love them. So this is just another look at the ones that are in the garden. And I started with the ones on the right. They're kind of small, narrow ones. And I started out putting asparagus in them because I thought it would be easier to maintain, but the squirrels found it very easy to dig into them, and so they managed to eat most of my roots after probably the second year. So there's still a few asparagus, but I learned my lesson there. So I've got garlic growing in one. So there's one whole bed that garlic goes in October and it harvests in June. So that kind of ties up the bed until then. And then I'll turn it over and put something else in. And then I have another one that's waiting for sweet potato starts that'll show up in just a couple of weeks. So there's a lot of resources out there. Like I said, this presentation will be available. Obviously, your local library. YouTube videos, there's so many things out there. It's just kind of fun to learn from other gardeners. And one of my favorites is Epic Gardening on YouTube. I highly recommend that. Pinterest is great, both for ideas for your garden, but once you harvest that food, for finding great recipes. And then the University of Maryland Extension Office is important for getting information that's relevant to growing in Maryland. And they also do a lot of programs as well. And they did Zooms over the winter and when you can't be out there gardening. And then the Poolsville Community Garden, we can be reached at that email. I was mentioning to somebody who was on earlier, to Melissa, that we just started a community seed library. And we started that with donation that we received from Ace Hardware, actually in Canton, in Baltimore City. And that got us going. We always wanted to start one. And then we have seeds both where our gardeners purchase large packets of seeds, and then we have divided them into smaller packets. And we have the idea of having seed saves, where gardeners who know how to save their seeds would eventually do seed saves, and then we package them and put them in the library and make them available to gardeners. So the seeds are free. If you're looking for, of course, we don't have everything, but I still do have quite a few seeds for this growing season. I mean, I know I've got cucumbers, tomatoes, and green peppers, and greens, and lots of different things. I mentioned to Melissa, I do have some wildflower seeds that were contributed. So we've got seeds, and if you're looking for some, you can email us at poolsvillecommunitygarden@gmail.com, and we'll figure out a way to get them to you. If you're local, we can just drop them off, or we can have them for pickup. But that's another resource that'll be growing, and we will be coming up with a better way to show the, what seeds we have available and how to request them. But that's it. And that's our contact information. And that's the link where if you go to that link, that's a community garden page off of the Poolsville Presbyterian Church website that has, it will have this presentation up there. Currently, I think the version of the presentation I did for the library is up there, but this one will be added in the next day too, but it has a lot of the same information. This just has a few additional slides. So I guess I'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, I can read a couple from the chat, and then if anyone else has a question that they like to ask, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and ask when we have a little bit of a lull. The first question I have is, does Poolsville's community garden provide the soil for the rental bed? I see Bill said yes, it's in the beds already.
Yeah, the beds are already, that's the whole idea, is that the beds are already created. So
our next question is, do your grid markers go to the bottom of the bed, or are they just guidelines on top?
Oh, you mean the markings of the squares? Is that what it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just on top. So actually what that was, I used like skewers, like wood skewers you would get for skewering meat in a grill. Mm-hmm. And just twine. And I just, measured off the foot, and I just tied it around the stick and tied it to the next stick and did it there very simply. Some people build grids out of wood. I actually started that way, and then I was like, I don't have time for this. And then the sticks and string is so easy, it works. Maybe next year. So yeah, it's just skewers, anything you have really around that, it just sticks, it'll stick into the soil, and then you just tie the strings around.
Does the community garden do routine watering or do renters come out to water their own?
No, everybody takes care of their own garden plot.
Can I be successful if my bed is only 6 to 8 inches deep? I'm afraid it's not deep enough.
Yeah, you can. You're a lot of things don't need that much depth. So it's just a question of what you're growing. Like if you're trying to grow carrots, that might not be enough depth. But if you're growing like lettuces and probably even tomatoes, like 8 inches is probably plenty. Usually you can look up the individual plant to see what kind of depth it needs, but it's really the things that are growing down that you have to worry about needing depth. So you can usually tell by the type of vegetable you're growing. Flowers would certainly be fine.
What kind of liners would you use to protect the boards and keep the soil in?
I mean, it depends on how the bed is built. If the boards are stacked on top of each other, you're not going to lose soil out the sides. We just use landscape. When I built the one that was at the end of my patio, we just put a piece of landscape fabric in the bottom and it kind of went up the sides a little bit, but the soil doesn't really come through the boards. Like the boards aren't perfectly joined. There's a slight gap, but not enough to let the soil out. So yeah, you can line up with landscape fabric as high up as you feel like you need to, but.
How do you manage traveler plants like a pumpkin?
In a raised bed, that's a good question. So there's a lot of vertical things you can do. Something like a pumpkin is kind of tough, but because the vines get so big. But one of the most interesting things that I've seen, and actually I added this to my in-ground, but because my raised beds are not lined up, but picture 2 raised beds with an aisle. You can take and create a trellis from raised bed 1 to raised bed 2 that actually creates an arch and a really fascinating feature. They've been using, this was things that I find on YouTube, and a cattle panel trellis. So you take a cattle panel, which is very strong, it will not rust, it will support the vines, and you put it in raised bed 1 and you bend it over, and the bottom of it then goes into raised bed 2. And usually you just secure it with a like a stake, a metal stake or whatever, and you just zip tie it to it. But it usually kind of stays put just from the physics of it, I guess. I'm not a science person. That's Bill's department.
No, we have next door neighbors that have done that, and it really looks neat. They have their pole beans growing over it, and it provides a beautiful little shady area underneath as well.
Yeah, it's really neat. And you can get a cattle panel trellis at Tractor Supply. The issue is getting it home. Because they're really long, they're 16 feet long. But I have one in ground I'm trying this year. That was something that I added because my raised beds aren't lined up nicely enough to do that. But I'm going to try that trellis with my spaghetti squash and my zucchini and my butternut squash and things like that. But they'll be in ground. But you can do it with a raised bed, and it's really nice if your raised beds are spaced properly. You can also get trellises. I don't know if you remember from the one picture, there was kind of a round trellis that my peas are growing on. Those are trellises that you can buy, or if you actually just take a walk in the community garden, you will see some examples. And that's not only do we have gorgeous native plantings, and a lot of them are marked, and when they're in bloom, they're just incredible. And you get ideas for your garden, but you'll get ideas from just looking at how other gardeners are managing their raised beds. So it's a great place to go. And we have gardeners that just create their own trellises for supporting their peas just out of tomato stakes and twine. They also make metal ones that are kind of like a teepee shape, and you can grow like cucumbers up on them, and then they'll kind of create a shade, and then maybe lettuce underneath, because as it gets hot, lettuce isn't going to do as well in the heat, but that creates a natural shade. So you kind of use the plants to do that. But I highly recommend, if you haven't been to the Poolsville Community Garden, to just go there and walk through and just take a look at the beds and see some of the ways the gardeners are managing their crops and vertical growing.
Mulch versus landscape fabric to cut down on weeds, which one do you prefer?
I wouldn't put landscape fabric in a raised bed. You don't need it. And any kind of mulch I would put on, I would try to use something that was more compost oriented or that will naturally decompose, like a straw that's safe. That's what I would do, because you're not going to get weeds. You're really not going to get a lot of weeds in a raised bed. You shouldn't, if your soil is right.
Do we have any more questions, either in the chat, or feel free to unmute and turn on your camera and ask?
I have a question,
Sure.
Sarah. Are there any types of plants or even flowers that you can mix with your vegetables that will help keep some of the pests that come in away?
Yeah.
It's a natural deterrent.
That's a great question. Marigolds are often used for that because of the smell. So a lot of times we plant marigolds near our tomatoes and throughout the garden and other plants. So and I'm sure there are probably other ones that are good companion plants. If you search on companion plants and for pest control, but marigolds is a popular one. And then sometimes too, people will even intersperse flowers, like low-lying flowers, to control, that's like a ground cover to make sure that there's no weeds. Let's say I've got 2 tomato plants and I've got some low area in between, and I have to skip a square. I can't really put another plant there because it's going to get so big. But I could put some like alyssum or something, a flower, a low-lying flower that kind of spread like a ground cover in that section. And it might bring, there may be some other flowers that might bring some pollinators around that would work well with your vegetable plants.
And how about, to add on to that, how about squirrels? We had huge issues. I mean, it was kind of entertaining to watch them go in and steal tomatoes and try to take off with huge tomatoes in their mouth, but it then it got a little irritating. They were stealing a little too many.
Yeah. So is this in your raised bed or in ground?
Yes. It's in my raised bed.
Okay. Well, tomatoes, it's a little bit harder because they get so big. So it's harder to. You can use. I didn't talk a lot about it, but for season extending, you can put hoops on your raised bed, and they do make some really tall ones, but even the ones I have wouldn't be tall enough for tomato plants because they get so big. It's hard to, but some of the smaller plants you can actually use cover for pest control as well. Like when plants are early and you're starting them out in your raised bed and you're trying to keep certain types of bugs out, you can use a light insect cover. The light will come through, and rain will typically come through. You might still have to water a little bit, but it'll get most of it. But that can help. But with tomatoes are so big. It's hard, and unless you build a structure that's tall enough to go over it that you can then drape a fabric, but then you end up having to take it off because they will get the sun, but they really need a lot of sun. So I don't know, it's hard with the squirrels. I've been battling them. I mean, they do come into my garden and they irritate me because they won't eat the whole thing. They take bites of it and they leave the rest of it on the picnic table. And I'm like, really? Could you not waste? But I fought with them with strawberries in ground. And so last year I did cover with insect weight fabric at night. And it was kind of a lot of work, but it saved my strawberries. And I have a pretty big crop and I can for the year. So yeah, I'll share a little bit, but then, I don't want them to eat it all. And the birds. So I have used covers. You could probably drape insect fabric without it's light enough that they're intended to be floating row covers. So I don't see why you couldn't maybe get some really really tall green stakes to kind of keep it up in the air and then just kind of drape it. I don't know. It's a lot of trial and error.
Right. They're pretty crafty.
They are very crafty.
Very crafty.
Everyone is always fighting the squirrels.
Yes.
They ate my asparagus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we
Thanks,
have
Ann.
any more questions?